Millionaire took his mistress. On a Babymoon meant for his pregnant wife. The wife took his empire. Instead, they say some secrets are too ugly to stay hidden, and for millionaire businessman Marcus Donovan, that secret was about to explode in the middle of a picture-perfect life with his pregnant wife. Eleanor rumors started swirling, another woman. Juliana was seen on a luxurious Babymoon trip in the Mediterranean. But it was no innocent coincidence that trip had been planned for Eleanor. If only she knew how her world was about to change forever, or how she would rise like a phoenix from the ashes of betrayal to snatch the empire that Marcus believed was his alone. This is a twisted tale of karma's grand design. From the outside looking in, Marcus Donovan appeared to have every advantage. Born into a modest but loving family in the suburbs of Baltimore, he was raised by two hard-working parents who always pushed him to chase his dreams. His father, Gregory Donovan, labored at a local construction firm, while his mother, Martha Donovan, balanced two jobs as a part-time librarian and a seamstress. Despite their limited means, they poured every last drop of their energy into their only child's future. Marcus grew up witnessing their relentless dedication to forging a better life, and it shaped him into a man determined to succeed, no matter the cost. By the time he was in college at the University of Pennsylvania, majoring in business administration, Marcus was already known for his unmatched ambition. He interned at Anderson & Crowley, a well-regarded investment firm, where he had a knack for impressing powerful executives. They saw him not just as a bright mind, but as someone who could influence others with his charm. He had a disarming smile, a smooth voice, and a razor-sharp intellect. Everyone predicted his meteoric rise. It felt inevitable. It was during a university networking event that he met Eleanor Taylor, a graduate student in art history who was volunteering for the fundraiser. What started as a brief conversation about Renaissance art blossomed into an unanticipated bond. Eleanor's kind, unassuming spirit and genuine curiosity about life and culture captivated Marcus in ways he never experienced before. She came from a quiet, artistic family. Her mother, Lucinda Taylor, was a painter, and her father, Robert Taylor, taught music at a conservatory. Unlike Marcus's intense drive for business success, Eleanor dreamed of opening a small gallery to showcase her mother's and other emerging artists' work. Although their pursuits were seemingly dissimilar, the synergy between them was magnetic. Marcus loved that Eleanor's perspective gave him a refuge from the relentless hustle of his business environment. She, in turn, admired his ambition and believed in his potential to do great things. He gave her the confidence to dream bigger. She gave him the humility to remember that riches went far beyond what sat in a bank account. For a while, the relationship was pure bliss. Late-night study sessions, peppered with stolen kisses in the university library, romantic walks through Philadelphia's cobblestone streets, and unwavering support in each other's endeavors. Even as Marcus was pulled deeper into the world of high-stakes finance, he managed to carve out time for Eleanor. He promised her a future that glowed with love and adventure. "I'll give you the world," he would say, sealing it with a spontaneous weekend trip to some quaint bed and breakfast. Eleanor, an idealist at heart, believed in his vow wholeheartedly. When he proposed getting down on one knee in front of 100 flickering candles at her favorite local art gallery, she couldn't say yes fast enough. Their wedding in upstate New York was attended by family close friends and a smattering of powerful business connections that Marcus had made. It seemed like the start of a dream that would only grow more vibrant with time. But with the passage of years, the dream changed shape. As Marcus soared in his career, starting Donovan Capital Ventures and establishing connections with Silicon Valley elites, Wall Street executives, and international investors, the simple joys of everyday life slipped out of his reach. He and Eleanor were still deeply in love, but their time together dwindled. Business dinners, conferences, and networking events took precedence. Eleanor struggled with the sense that she was losing the man she had pledged her life to, though she tried her best to stay supportive. She started hosting art events to keep herself busy and to offer a platform for her mother's work. Yet she always tried to leave the front porch light on, hoping Marcus would come home early and remind her they were still the same people who once found refuge in each other's arms. Behind the polished veneer of success, cracks were forming, cracks that wouldn't show themselves until life took a dramatic, life-altering turn. A year into their new life of glittering galas and high roller gatherings, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. She told Marcus one morning as he was rushing to finalize a major overseas deal. He was halfway out the door, coffee in one hand and a phone pressed to his ear, when she pulled him aside, eyes brimming with an anxious excitement. "Marcus," she said softly, "I'm pregnant." The moment froze. The phone call, the multi-million-dollar contract, waiting the business world swirling around him, it all faded. In that second, it was just him, Eleanor, and the promise of new life. He lifted her into his arms, tears of joy reflecting in both of their eyes. For the first time in a long time, the tension of business deals, deadlines, and responsibilities melted away. Life felt simple and hopeful again. Eleanor was 3 months pregnant when they decided to host a celebratory dinner at an upscale restaurant called the Redwood Lounge in Manhattan. They reserved a private room and invited their closest circle of friends and family, Marcus's parents. Gregory and Martha were there, beaming with pride. Eleanor's parents, Lucinda and Robert, were equally ecstatic. Champagne flowed, though Eleanor stuck to her sparkling grape juice. Amid toasts and laughter, Marcus promised again he would step back from the intensity of his schedule and be there for his growing family. He asked everyone to raise a glass and said, "To our unborn child and to the bright future we'll share." A wave of applause and cheers filled the room. In the weeks that followed, life felt like it was returning to that earlier state of bliss. Marcus took Eleanor to her doctor's appointments. He'd spend Saturdays helping her organize the spare room in their penthouse into a nursery. He even started thinking about a Babymoon, a pre-birth vacation for them to unwind and connect before the baby arrived. Eleanor's face lit up when he proposed 2 weeks in the south of France. It was a grand romantic gesture that made her hopeful they were truly turning a corner. But the closer they got to finalizing the trip dates, the more frequently those old habits crept in. Marcus would be called away on urgent business, or else he'd lock himself in his home office for hours glued to conference calls with Hong Kong investors. His free time evaporated again. Eleanor worried that if this was the pattern before the baby even arrived, how would he adjust once a newborn demanded all their attention and energy? Nonetheless, she kept faith. She knew business deals could be unpredictable, especially when millions of dollars were at stake. She rationalized, "He's doing this for us. He wants to secure our future. He'll be there when it matters most." It was a mantra she repeated each night, even as she felt the creeping loneliness that threatened to overshadow what should have been the happiest time of her life. Marcus, on the other hand, juggled overwhelming stress from multiple fronts. Donovan Capital Ventures was in a prime expansion phase, and missing crucial deals could mean losing the momentum he'd built over a decade. He justified each missed doctor's appointment and each cancelled dinner by telling himself that once the deals were sealed, he'd have the money and reputation to provide a life of comfort, no luxury for Eleanor and their child. So he pushed on day after day, fueling himself with ambition and adrenaline, hardly noticing that he was accelerating toward a moral precipice. As Donovan Capital Ventures expanded, Marcus came into contact with an even wider circle of corporate bigwigs, international deal-makers and socialites. One such acquaintance was Lawrence Chen, an influential tech magnate who had a flair for elaborate parties. Through Lawrence, Marcus found himself invited to exclusive yacht soirees on the Mediterranean high-stakes poker nights in Macau and lavish ski trips in the Swiss Alps. All these gatherings promised not only entertainment, but also a direct line to the world's wealthiest decision-makers. It was at one of Lawrence's high-profile events that Marcus first encountered Giuliana Moretti. She was an Italian-Brazilian heiress with a well-known family name, rumored to be an aspiring fashion designer, tall and poised with a graceful yet predatory air. She was the kind of woman who seemed to float through a room, drawing every eye. Her conversation was as sharp as her appearance. She'd spent her youth studying in the finest boarding schools in Europe, and she spoke 4 languages fluently. She seemed genuinely intrigued by Marcus's success story, or at least that's how she presented herself. He first noticed her at a New York charity gala, swirling her champagne and laughing with a group of media moguls. Their eyes locked, and for a brief moment, Marcus felt that old spark of curiosity. She was mesmerizing in a way that was impossible to ignore. After a polite introduction, they engaged in small talk about the charity's mission. Within minutes, they pivoted to more personal topics: her upcoming fashion line, his global expansion strategies, her travels across Asia. Giuliana lavished him with compliments that flattered not just his ego, but the deeper part of him that felt underappreciated and overstretched. She seemed to understand the pressures he was under, empathizing with the burden of steering a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Although he told himself it was harmless, Marcus began inviting Giuliana to smaller get-togethers with key investors. He valued her social acumen and thought she could help lubricate business discussions with her grace and wit. One dinner turned into another. Soon casual texts about upcoming events drifted into more personal territory. Giuliana was skilled at emotional lure, often sending messages late at night when Marcus's defenses were down. "I'm thinking of you. Hope you're getting some rest." Or, "You looked so stressed today. Remember to take care of yourself." Her words ignited a feeling of being seen and validated in a way he hadn't felt for months. The lines blurred so subtly that Marcus wasn't sure when their professional rapport shifted into a personal affair. Perhaps it was the night they attended an after-party in Monaco, where the champagne never stopped flowing, the music pulsed till dawn, and everyone else seemed consumed by their own indulgences. In a moment of disoriented excitement, Marcus found himself alone on a balcony with Giuliana. The moon glistened on the sea below, and her perfume swirled around him like an intoxicating promise. Before he fully comprehended, they were locked in a passionate kiss. The guilt that followed was profound, yet not enough to halt what they had begun. He told himself it was a one-time slip. However, the affair continued clandestine, but thrilling, fueling him with a sense of danger and novelty that overshadowed the moral voice within. Each time he returned home to Eleanor, who was by then visibly pregnant and glowing with maternal radiance, he felt a dual wave of shame and heartbreak. He still loved Eleanor, or so he claimed, yet he couldn't shake the magnetism of Giuliana, the adrenaline rush of their secret. Despite these pangs of conscience, he rationalized that it was his life too. He'd worked endlessly for success, so he had earned an escape from the daily grind. He believed that as long as Eleanor never found out, no harm was done. After all, he was still providing for his wife and child. He still intended to keep his promise of giving them everything, but in the hidden corners of his mind, even he couldn't ignore the flicker of trepidation. Some part of him knew that if Eleanor discovered his betrayal, it would unravel everything. By the 7th month of Eleanor's pregnancy, her doctor recommended a period of rest and relaxation. High blood pressure and stress were common in first-time mothers, and a calm environment could make all the difference. Eleanor, remembering Marcus's initial grand suggestion of a trip to the south of France, brought up the possibility again. Her voice carried a quiet plea. "You said we would go together, just you and me, before the baby arrives." He nodded absently, scanning through his phone's endless alerts. She cradled her expanding belly, waiting for him to look at her with warmth, waiting for the man she once knew to surface. Finally, he pressed his phone's screen off, right, of course. A baby moon. He smiled, but it felt forced. "Let me get my schedule in order, and we'll plan something special." Eleanor's face lit with hope. She felt a gush of relief that perhaps the old Marcus was still there under the layers of suits, spreadsheets, and urgent phone calls. She suggested a quaint coastal town in the south of France, perhaps Cassis or Antibes, somewhere quieter than the usual tourist hotspots. He agreed, half listening, half distracted by the beeping of another incoming message. Within days, however, business crises flared up like wildfires. An investor in Hong Kong threatened to pull out of a major deal. A West Coast tech company's stock was plummeting, which threatened Donovan Capital's stake. Conference calls spanned time zones. Meetings doubled, then tripled. Every day, Marcus found a new reason to postpone the trip. "Just one more week," he kept promising. "We'll head out as soon as I sort this out." Eleanor tried to remain patient. She decorated the nursery carefully, choosing pastel shades of green and yellow. She arranged for a local carpenter to craft a handmade crib. She even started prenatal yoga to maintain her health and manage her stress. Still, the longing to spend meaningful time with Marcus grew stronger, and the heartbreak of repeated postponements deepened. In the midst of that turmoil, a cunning idea crept into Juliana's mind. She knew all about the Babymoon plan. Marcus had once carelessly mentioned it, not realizing how it might ignite her envy. Juliana wanted Marcus to herself, unencumbered by marital obligations or the looming presence of a child. She manipulated him, planting seeds of discontent and urging him to take her somewhere far from the prying eyes of the media and corporate watchers. For once, she wanted to see if Marcus would pick her convenience over his wife's rightful place. Marcus, exhausted and lured by the promise of unrestrained pleasure, found himself agreeing. In a moment of self-delusion, he convinced himself that a quick getaway with Juliana was a better move. He could merge leisure with networking, claiming that she had connections to an international fashion mogul who could become a valuable investor. In the twisted logic of a man who had already begun to tangle his moral compass, it seemed justifiable. So he booked the flights. 4 days in the south of France. Luxury suite at an exclusive resort in Cannes, complete with private beach access and a dedicated concierge. He told Eleanor he had to leave unexpectedly for a business emergency in Europe. She was nearly 8 months pregnant, but the heartbreak in her eyes didn't stop him. He packed his suitcase hurriedly one afternoon, gave her a tepid kiss on the cheek, and said he'd call every day. As Marcus and Juliana soared across the Atlantic, Eleanor was left alone in the penthouse, the Babymoon brochures still on the kitchen counter, mocking the dream that was never realized. She felt a swelling ache in her chest, part anxiety, part suspicion. Although she wanted to believe him, cracks in her trust had begun to form. She sensed that something was off, but she couldn't yet piece it together. In Cannes, Marcus and Juliana basked in the sun, sipping on exotic cocktails under striped beach umbrellas. They indulged in gourmet meals, danced late into the night, and posted snippets of their lavish escapade on social media, albeit carefully curated, to avoid revealing each other's identities. Too blatantly, Marcus's official story was that this was a critical investor meeting. But in a world as interconnected as theirs, secrets can slip through the cracks faster than a wave receding on the shore. A paparazzo named Henri Lambert was trailing various celebrities that weekend. He was known for sniffing out the hidden corners where Europe's rich and famous frolicked away from public view. While scanning the beach for a rumored Hollywood couple, he stumbled upon Marcus Donovan and Juliana Moretti instead. At first, he couldn't believe his luck. Marcus Donovan was a rising star in the finance world, rumored to be squeaky clean and happily married. Yet here he was, comfortably entwined with a woman who was definitely not his pregnant wife. Henry snapped a flurry of photos, the two of them sipping wine on a balcony, Juliana leaning in to whisper in Marcus's ear a playful kiss on the cheek. None of it left any plausible deniability. Henry knew he had gold in his camera, a scandal involving a high-profile millionaire about to become a father. Tabloid heaven. He quickly sold the photos to a gossip website known as the Gold Coast Insider. Within hours, the pictures went viral. Social media platforms lit up with speculation. Who is this mystery woman? Where is his wife? The images were accompanied by headlines dripping with condemnation. Marcus Donovan's secret. Babymoon with Mistress finance, mogul in a scandalous affair. Even mainstream news sites picked up the rumor mill Eleanor was home in New York, nursing an aching back and reading baby blogs when her phone buzzed non-stop. She opened one message to find a link from an old college friend. "Elle, please, tell me this isn't real." Followed by the incriminating photos. For a heartbeat, she felt like the ground caved in beneath her. The images showed Marcus in an unmistakably intimate pose with a glamorous brunette. Shock turned to devastation, then to rising anger. Betrayal scorched through her veins. She slumped on the living room couch, tears falling silently as she clutched her pregnancy bump. How could he do this to her, to them? Her phone calls to Marcus went unanswered. She tried texting him, but the messages remained unread. In a panic, she called her mother, Lucinda, who arrived within the hour, enveloping Eleanor in a maternal hug that momentarily soothed her shattered heart. Yet not even a mother's love could fully dull the sting of this calamity. The headlines were everywhere, and the story was unstoppable. When Marcus finally saw the tabloid news panic set in, he tried to contact his public relations team to mitigate the scandal, but the damage was already colossal. Investors started asking questions. His phone rang incessantly, with messages from business partners furious that this personal fiasco might tarnish their brand associations. Most of all, though, he dreaded hearing from Eleanor. He was 1,000 miles away, physically and emotionally, with no immediate plan to rectify the devastation he'd unleashed. Juliana, on the other hand, feigned worry, but secretly relished the storm. In her mind, this was an opportunity to force Marcus's hand. If his marriage was irrevocably damaged, he might choose her. She coaxed him, telling him that everything would be fine, that he could spin the narrative, but deep down she knew the path to power was lit up before her. Back in New York, Eleanor quietly fumed. It wasn't just heartbreak. It was a sense of betrayal that ignited a newfound resolve in her. She felt her unborn child move inside her, and that reminder filled her with fierce determination. The man she loved had humiliated her on a global stage. The father of her child had broken the final bond of trust. Through her tears, a seed of defiance began to grow. She would not crumble and be the sympathetic, powerless wife in this story. She would fight for her dignity and for her child's future. When Marcus returned to New York, the scandal was already raging. Eleanor met him in their penthouse, calm, composed, but with a steely gaze. "You've humiliated me," she said quietly. "You broke everything we built. I won't be a forgotten footnote in your story." Without drama or tears, Eleanor began to act. She may not have held financial power, but she knew her emotional and strategic contributions had helped shape Donovan Capital from the beginning. She hired Danielle Pierce, a formidable divorce lawyer, known for high-stakes corporate cases. Quietly they gathered evidence, financial records, contracts, early investments, all proving Eleanor's unseen influence in Marcus's empire. While Marcus focused on salvaging his image, Eleanor was preparing for war. Then came Juliana's twist, a sudden message claiming she was pregnant. Whether true or not, it rattled Marcus. But for Eleanor, it only fueled her resolve. She wasn't going to shield him anymore. With her baby due soon and the media still circling, Eleanor temporarily left the penthouse for her parents' quiet home. She wasn't retreating, she was regrouping. This time not as the betrayed wife, but as a woman ready to claim what was rightfully hers. As Eleanor's due date approached, the media frenzy refused to die down. Tongues wagged about whether she'd name Marcus as the father on the birth certificate if they proceeded with divorce. Stock in Donovan Capital Ventures dipped as rumors circulated that the founder was on the brink of losing control of his assets. Rival companies circled like sharks, ready to snap up clients or key employees who questioned Donovan Capital's stability. Under the weight of all these pressures, Marcus seemed to crumble. His once unshakable self-confidence slipped into desperation. He called Eleanor multiple times a day, begging for a face-to-face meeting. She granted him a single meeting under the watchful eye of her lawyer, Danielle Pierce, at a neutral location, a private conference room at Clark and Grayton. Law firm. When Marcus arrived, he looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, suit jacket hanging off his once proud shoulders. Eleanor, on the other hand, wore a simple navy maternity dress and radiated a quiet strength. She was mere weeks away from delivering her belly, a poignant reminder of all that was at stake. Marcus attempted a gentle approach. "Eleanor, I've made terrible mistakes," he said, voice trembling. "I want to fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." She studied him for a long moment, her eyes reflecting sorrow and disappointment. Danielle, seated beside her, remained silent, but watchful. Finally, Eleanor replied softly, "We cannot be fixed." "Marcus, you did not just break our vows, you shattered my trust. That is something I can't repair. I'm here to discuss a settlement only for the sake of our child's future." Marcus pleaded for a second chance, enumerating the ways he could make amends. He would cut off Juliana completely, vow fidelity, attend therapy. However, the time for contrition had passed. Eleanor made it clear she wanted a divorce, and not just a simple one. She wanted a fair share of the empire, citing her intangible but vital contributions to the business's growth. Danielle slid a carefully prepared document across the table, listing assets that would be put in Eleanor's name. It included a controlling stake of certain business ventures, real estate properties, and trust funds for the child. Marcus's face blanched. His initial reaction was disbelief, followed by anger. "This is absurd," he spat. You have no right to dismantle my company. Danielle calmly explained the legal precedents supporting Eleanor's case. She detailed how the intangible contributions of a spouse could factor into a divorce settlement, particularly given the nature of how Donovan Capital Ventures expanded. She hinted at potential reputational damage if certain internal documents were made public. This was the final straw. The unspoken threat of financial audits, negative media attention, and investor flight made Marcus realize that losing a large portion of his empire might be unavoidable if he didn't negotiate. The meeting concluded in a cold standoff. Marcus stormed out, furious at Danielle, and by extension, furious at Eleanor. For her part, Eleanor left feeling both liberated and terrified. She was stepping into an unknown future, but at least she was no longer treading water in the whirlpool of Marcus's transgressions. She returned to her parents' home, trying to focus on her baby's imminent arrival, rather than the storm swirling around her. Eleanor went into labor on a quiet Sunday morning. The world outside was still enthralled with the scandal, but within the walls of Lucinda and Robert Taylor's home, all that mattered was bringing new life into the world. With her mother and a private doula by her side, Eleanor felt contractions that intensified by the hour Marcus received a call from Eleanor's mother, telling him that he could come to the hospital if he wished Eleanor had agreed for him to be present, not as her partner, but as the father of the child. Despite the tension, she believed their baby had the right to both parents at the birth. In a rush of guilt and paternal instinct, Marcus cancelled his meetings and raced to Mount Sinai Hospital. When he arrived, Eleanor was already in active labor, sweat beading on her forehead, breathing heavily through contractions. She acknowledged his presence with a nod. There was no forgiveness in her eyes, but there was also no malice at that moment. Whatever had passed between them, they were both there to welcome their child. After hours of determined pushing, baby Henry Donovan entered the world with a hearty cry. He had Eleanor's delicate features, but Marcus's intense gaze. Watching him take his first breath brought tears to Marcus's eyes. Tears of awe, shame, and overwhelming emotion. Eleanor spent from the labor, cradled Henry gently, all her focus on this tiny being who held the promise of a new beginning. For a brief time, the hospital room seemed suspended in tranquility. Marcus murmured an apology to Eleanor, and she simply nodded, too exhausted to pass the complexities of their fractured relationship. The press inevitably got wind of the birth, but the hospital's security kept them at bay. Danielle discreetly arranged for an extended stay, so Eleanor could recover, without the media circus camped outside her door. Yet the respite was short-lived. Once Henry was born, the details of the divorce settlement took on a new urgency. Even as he marveled at his newborn son, Marcus was bombarded by calls from his lawyers urging him to avoid signing away the empire. He faced a decision, risk a protracted legal battle that could drag on for years and wreak havoc on his business reputation, or meet Eleanor's demands for a settlement that would permanently alter his fortune. During one of Eleanor's quieter moments in the hospital, Marcus approached her. "I don't want to fight you in court. Our child shouldn't grow up watching us tear each other apart." Eleanor studied him, her expression neutral. She too didn't want a prolonged battle, especially with Henry's future to consider. She simply stated, "Then come to an agreement with Danielle. Stop trying to cling to power because in the end, you'll lose more than just money." In that moment, Marcus glimpsed anew. Eleanor resolved, resilient, and far from the naive, gentle soul he had once taken for granted. He recognized that she was not only fighting for her own dignity, but for the child they had brought into the world. Though a flicker of pride stirred in his heart at her strength, it was overshadowed by the realization that he was on the losing side of this battle. Morally, and soon financially, Eleanor Donovan sat in the back seat of a black SUV, its tinted windows shielding her from the flashbulbs that exploded along Manhattan's bustling sidewalks. Cradling baby Henry in her arms, she felt a surge of protectiveness and an equal measure of quiet determination. The day had finally come for her legal team to square off with Marcus and his lawyers. She gazed through the tinted glass at the soaring skyscrapers. Once this city had symbolized the pinnacle of her husband's ambition. Now it was the stage on which she would fight for her dignity, her child's future, and a fair claim to the empire she had helped build. The legal battleground was the top-floor conference suite at Clark & Grayton Law Firm, a stately glass tower rising like a monolith of power in Midtown Manhattan. Eleanor's lawyer, Danielle Pierce, was known in elite circles as the litigator you'd hire if you had everything to lose. She had already amassed hundreds of files, emails and financial statements that documented the many ways Eleanor had contributed, directly or indirectly, to the expansion of Donovan Capital Ventures. And yet Danielle insisted on another layer of evidence personal testimony about Eleanor's role behind the scenes. The intangible but crucial ways she had secured philanthropic deals and introduced Marcus to key art investors now held center stage in the negotiations. In the weeks leading up to the showdown, Danielle worked around the clock. She had enlisted the help of forensic accountants to comb through Donovan Capital's labyrinthine web of offshore companies and shell subsidiaries. Every questionable transaction that might hint at hidden funds or deliberate concealments was highlighted and sorted into neat binders. There were also frantic late-night calls with potential witnesses like the couple's longtime financial advisor, Richard Albright, who'd confided how Eleanor's early inheritance had covered some of Marcus's high-risk investments. Eleanor had never bragged about that early contribution. She had believed in her husband wholeheartedly and wanted to see his dreams come true. Now that goodwill became proof of her rightful claim. Meanwhile, Marcus's legal team was scrambling to protect him. They were led by a seasoned corporate attorney named Vivian Hill, known for her no-nonsense style and an unflinching loyalty to wealthy executives. Vivian's approach was simple: attack, discredit, and minimize Eleanor's role. She intended to lean on the couple's prenuptial agreement, a document that on paper seemed to limit Eleanor's share should the marriage dissolve. But as Danielle Pierce liked to remind people in such high-stakes divorces, no prenup is bulletproof when moral turpitude and undisclosed assets come into play. Eleanor didn't attend the initial round of negotiations. Holding a newborn in a stuffy boardroom filled with adversaries was the last thing she wanted. Instead, she stayed in the comfort of her Brooklyn townhouse, nursing Henry, while Danielle and her associate Martin Feldman headed the talks. But the moment Danielle walked through those heavy glass doors, the tension was palpable. On one side of the long mahogany table, Marcus Donovan sat stiff-backed arms, folded protectively over his chest. His once impeccable confidence was fraying at the edges. Dark circles beneath his eyes hinted at nights lost to worry. The CFO of Donovan Capital, Daniel Redwood, a private confidant to Marcus for years, sat beside him in a pinstriped suit, methodically tapping a pen against a legal pad. Redwood's face gave nothing away, but the deeper lines on his brow suggested he knew exactly how precarious Marcus's position had become. Across from them was Danielle, impeccably dressed in a charcoal grey suit that seemed tailored to exude power. Her eyes flicked over the group in a cool, assessing glance, zeroing in on Marcus. "You did this to yourself, buddy," she seemed to say. Without uttering a word, Vivian Hill cleared her throat and began. "My client is prepared to offer a sizable monetary settlement," she said, handing out typed sheets. We respect Mrs. Donovan's contributions, but we believe the prenuptial agreement stands." Danielle allowed herself a small, knowing smile. She flipped through the pages without so much as a pause, and then calmly placed them on the table. "My client seeks more than a one-time payout. She seeks ongoing support for the child. Yes, but also recognition of the intangible support she gave to Donovan Capital. We have itemized evidence, emails, schedules, financial entries, showing how Mrs. Donovan facilitated multiple investor introductions and philanthropic partnerships that led to direct profitability for Donovan Capital." Vivian bristled but maintained her composure. "We dispute the scope of those contributions." Danielle's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps we should discuss the early loan from Mrs. Donovan's inheritance, which helped your client secure the original office space and cover those initial margin calls during Donovan Capital's first expansion phase. I believe the figure was—" She checked a document, $250,000, hardly pocket change. "We also have Mr. Richard Albright, the couple's longtime financial advisor, ready to testify that Mrs. Donovan's involvement was fundamental to the firm's survival in its infancy." Marcus's expression darkened. He had hoped that early personal loan would remain a forgotten piece of ancient history, but Danielle was resurrecting every skeleton buried in Donovan Capital's closet. Even as the negotiations grew heated, an unspoken spectre hovered over the table. Juliana Moretti, the mistress whose presence had triggered the avalanche of scandal. Though physically absent from the boardroom, her impact was undeniable. Gossip rags still speculated about her rumored pregnancy. Investors quietly mulled whether Donovan Capital was hemorrhaging funds to appease her. And in hushed conversations, people wondered if Juliana might sell her story to a tell-all publication. As if on cue, Marcus's phone buzzed noisily, cutting through the tense silence. He glanced at it and his jaw tightened. Danielle raised an eyebrow. Vivian slammed a folder shut, irate at the interruption. "We need a moment," Vivian announced, escorting Marcus into an adjacent private lounge. Inside the lounge, Marcus exhaled heavily. He stared at the text from Juliana. "We have unfinished business. If you don't meet me tonight, I'll go public." It was a threat she'd lobbed before, but in the heat of divorce negotiations, the stakes were higher than ever. "Is it her?" Vivian asked, arms crossed. "Yeah," Marcus muttered, rubbing his temples. "She's threatening to spill everything if I don't." Vivian cut him off, voice low with frustration. "We don't have time for this. We're already negotiating from a position of weakness. Danielle Pierce has evidence that could shred your reputation if it goes to trial. If Juliana also goes to the media, it's over. You'll lose what little leverage you have left." Marcus felt a swell of anger mingle with defeat. He wanted to lash out, to break something, to be rid of Juliana and her manipulations. But he was caught trapped by the consequences of his own betrayal. "What do I do?" he asked, almost whispering. "Handle it," Vivian said sharply. "Shut her down. Get her to sign an NDA. Throw money at her if you must. But do not let her sabotage these negotiations." When they returned to the conference room, Danielle and Martin were exchanging quiet words. Danielle looked up, assessing Marcus's grim expression. She could guess Juliana had just made her presence known again. Good, Danielle thought. Let him squirm. It only strengthened her side of the table. The negotiations resumed, and over the course of the next 3 hours the atmosphere grew even heavier. Danielle meticulously dissected Donovan Capital's structure, pointing to subsidiary after subsidiary that had flourished because of philanthropic connections forged by Eleanor. She cited philanthropic galas, where Eleanor had introduced Marcus to major art patrons like Penelope Carnegie, who later became a silent investor. She had emails confirming Eleanor's role in persuading a West Coast museum patron to place $1 million trust with Donovan Capital. On it went, each bullet point chipping away at the notion that Eleanor was merely a supportive spouse with no legal claim. Marcus's lawyers attempted to minimize and deflect. "These are normal acts of spousal support," Vivian stated firmly. "They don't necessarily translate into equity stakes or managerial control." Danielle caught Marcus's gaze. "My client is not asking for half the company," she explained, voice firm but measured. "She wants an equitable share, reflecting the intangible contributions that were instrumental in turning Donovan Capital into the success it is today. Moreover, she wants a controlling interest in the philanthropic branch, which was largely her brainchild." Marcus's brow furrowed. The philanthropic branch. A small part of the firm, yes, but one with growing influence and positive press. Handing it over would mean giving Eleanor a permanent seat at the table of Donovan Capital's future. He imagined the headlines, "Eleanor Donovan heads philanthropic ventures after high-profile divorce." It made him feel nauseous, but his options were dwindling by the second. Redwood leaned in and whispered something to Marcus, presumably about the potential damage to investor confidence if the negotiations dragged on. Marcus nodded curtly, then turned to Vivian. They shared a brief, tense exchange of whispers. Finally, Vivian laid down her pen. "We will consider this philanthropic branch as negotiable." Danielle's eyes flicked to Martin, a silent note of victory passing between them. The philanthropic division was not just a footnote in Donovan Capital's portfolio. It was a rising star with significant press coverage for eco-friendly initiatives and socially responsible tech investments. Ceding control of it was a symbolic blow to Marcus's legacy. What followed was a grueling carousel of back-and-forth bartering. Marcus offered a one-time payout that would set Eleanor up for life. Danielle refused unless it included child support, reflecting the lifestyle Henry would have had if the marriage remained intact. When Marcus's team countered with a smaller monthly figure, Danielle threatened to reveal offshore accounts and questionable business practices. In open court, a guaranteed feeding frenzy for regulators and tabloids alike. Eleanor, following the negotiations from her home through text updates from Danielle, felt a swirl of emotions. Part of her despised the transactional nature of these talks. "This is my life," she thought. "My marriage." But there was no denying that wealth was a tool to secure a stable future for her son. She reminded herself that no amount of money could replace the trust Marcus had shattered, but it could ensure Henry never lacked for opportunity. Meanwhile, as the hours stretched, Marcus's phone kept buzzing. Juliana's messages grew more desperate. "Answer me or face the consequences." He battled the urge to throw his phone across the room. Danielle noticed his agitation and made a mental note that Juliana's tactics were likely driving him to make hurried decisions, an advantage for her client. At around 7 in the evening, both teams called for a recess, leaving the table strewn with legal pads, half-empty coffee cups, and a storm of scattered documents. Marcus slumped in his chair, loosened his tie, and rubbed his eyes. In the hallway, Redwood took a phone call from the Donovan Capital board, who demanded an update. The board was growing furious at the negative media coverage. They wanted this scandal tidied up faster. Danielle and Martin stepped into a private corner where they whispered about final strategies. "If we push him on philanthropic control, we can likely secure a stake in that ecotech subsidiary too." Martin suggested. Danielle nodded, eyes gleaming. With the board pushing Marcus to settle, he was more malleable to their demands. She drafted a quick bullet list on her tablet, preparing for one last push when they reconvened. An hour later, the negotiations climaxed. Vivian, clearly exasperated, announced, "We have a client who is willing to cooperate, but only if the settlement includes confidentiality clauses about Donovan Capital's internal finances. Danielle nodded. We can include mutual NDAs on the finances, on the condition that Mrs. Donovan retains complete ownership of the philanthropic branch and partial equity in the Ecotech spin-off. She handed over a revised agreement. Sign this tonight, or we walk away and proceed to trial. Marcus locked eyes with Danielle, then lowered his gaze to the document. He knew this was the best offer he'd get. If he went to court, Danielle could drag out every skeleton in Donovan Capital's closet, not just the affair, but any shady financial corners he'd cut in the firm's early days. Share prices would plummet, and the board would oust him for good. He gave a weary nod to Vivian, who let out a resigned sigh and pushed the papers across the table. Donovan, Vivian said, extending a pen sign here. Marcus gripped the pen, his gaze distant, as he scrawled his signature in the designated boxes. With each stroke of ink, a chunk of his empire slipped away. Danielle carefully collected the documents. "Thank you, Mr. Donovan," she said, her tone formal. She tapped them into a neat stack and placed them in her briefcase. "My client appreciates your cooperation, and I'll have the final copies delivered to you by tomorrow." Standing, Marcus thrust his hands into his pockets and stared at the floor. He'd never felt so powerless. The hush in the room was thick with finality. Later that night in her Brooklyn townhouse, Eleanor received a phone call from Danielle. "It's done," Danielle announced. "We have controlling interest of the philanthropic branch, partial equity in Ecotech, sufficient child support, and a non-disclosure arrangement to protect your personal details. Henry will be well provided for, and you'll have the freedom to guide the philanthropy division. However you see fit." Eleanor closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. Relief mingled with a pang of sorrow. She'd stood up for herself and won. But it had come at the cost of accepting that her marriage and the man she'd once adored were lost to a web of lies and betrayal. Still, as she looked down at baby Henry, dozing in a bassinet nearby, she felt a flicker of hope. He would never want for stability or security. She had ensured that his future wasn't tied to Marcus's reckless choices. Across town, Marcus sat alone in his penthouse, now stripped of many personal touches, as Eleanor's belongings had been removed. The echoing silence was almost cruel. His phone buzzed again. Juliana, no doubt. He stared at the screen but couldn't bring himself to answer. His empire was in freefall, his reputation tarnished, and the only family he had now seemed beyond his reach. He sank into a leather armchair, head in his hands, as the lights of the city stretched out below him in apathetic indifference. The legal war was over, but the aftermath would ripple for years. In the eyes of the world, Eleanor had seized a critical piece of Donovan Capital's future, an accomplishment that would soon send her star rising in philanthropic and business circles alike. Marcus, once hailed as a visionary titan, watched his kingdom fracture under the weight of his own hubris. And somewhere out there, in the swirl of scandal and secrecy, Juliana Moretti plotted her next move, determined to claim whatever she could from the empire's wreckage. But for Eleanor, the greatest triumph was not the money or even the philanthropic branch. It was reclaiming her autonomy, proving that she was more than just a shadow in Marcus's ambitious world. The settlement marked an end, yet for her and Henry, it was also the quiet beginning of a far more authentic life, one built on the unshakable foundation of self-respect and unconditional love. In the weeks after the settlement, life moved at a breathless pace. Marcus attempted damage control with his board, reassuring them that Donovan Capital Ventures still had strong leadership. However, the trust between him and his key partners was irrevocably eroded. Several major investors parted ways, citing moral and reputational concerns. Others demanded restructuring that further diluted Marcus's control. Juliana's claims of pregnancy were eventually discredited. She had never provided legitimate proof, and many suspected it was a ploy. Jilted and humiliated, she slinked off to Europe, facing her own set of gossip. By contrast, Eleanor found a surprising sense of renewal. She relocated to a serene townhouse in a family-friendly neighborhood in Brooklyn. With her parents' help, she furnished the space so it exuded warmth and creativity. Local artwork on the walls, a cozy reading nook by the window, and a sunlit nursery for Henry between breastfeeding late-night lullabies and the occasional meltdown. She felt more alive than ever. There was sadness still for the broken dreams and the man she once loved. But she also felt unshackled free to chart her own course. Despite not being a ruthless business tycoon, Eleanor found herself thrust into an unexpected position of power. The philanthropic branch of Donovan Capital that she controlled needed direction, and she gave it wholeheartedly. She rebranded it as the Green Horizon Fund, focusing on eco-sustainability, social justice initiatives, and arts in underprivileged communities. She hired a small team of like-minded individuals, some from Marcus's circle, who felt more aligned with her vision. In an ironic twist, the Green Horizon Fund quickly garnered positive media attention, drawing in philanthropic entrepreneurs who had grown skeptical of traditional profit-obsessed finance. Financially secure from the divorce settlement, Eleanor didn't have to scramble for revenue. Instead, she invested her emotional energy in building a legacy that Henry could be proud of. The mother who once quietly supported her husband's dream now became a leader in her own right. And the world noticed, meanwhile. Marcus struggled in the shadows. The scandal's aftershock still rippled through the corporate world, making every new partnership a challenge. He sold off some properties to maintain the liquidity needed to stabilize Donovan Capital. Investors demanded transparency, and he spent sleepless nights just trying to preserve what was left. The flamboyant lifestyle he once enjoyed with private jets and lavish parties was replaced by frantic, damage-control dinners and closed-door negotiations. The final blow, Karma's crowning moment, arrived when a whistleblower from Juliana's circle leaked incriminating details of Marcus's offshore accounts and questionable business practices. Though not entirely illegal, the revelations cast serious doubts on his ethics. Regulators launched inquiries. The board forced him to temporarily step down as CEO, installing an interim figurehead to steer Donovan Capital until the dust settled. Marcus, once the unstoppable force in the world of high finance, found himself drowning in self-inflicted misery. He tried to see Henry when he could court-ordered visitation schedules. Sometimes he'd gaze at his son in the crib, marveling at how pure and untainted the child was by the swirling chaos. In those tender, wordless moments, he realized the depth of his miscalculation. He had gained the world in fleeting fame and fortune, but lost the loyalty of a good woman, the stability of a solid family, and the respect of those who once admired him. Eleanor, on the other hand, glowed with the fulfillment of someone who had found her path, albeit through heartbreak. She no longer carried the illusions of a fairy tale marriage. Instead, she stood firm on a foundation of self-worth, maternal devotion, and a dream that had become her own to shape. She was far from perfect. Late nights still brought sorrowful memories, and the weight of single parenthood was immense. But each step forward, every milestone in the Green Horizon Fund, and every coo or giggle from Henry reminded her that she was not just surviving. She was thriving. In the end, the story of Marcus Donovan's Babymoon betrayal was overshadowed by a far more compelling narrative. The remarkable resilience of Eleanor Donovan, the woman who refused to be a victim of circumstance. She had taken the shattered pieces of her marriage and transformed them into building blocks for a future she could proudly call her own. The empire that Marcus once claimed as his birthright was now reshaped by the very person he had betrayed, and the world applauded the justice in that reversal of fortune. In this whirlwind saga of infidelity, heartbreak, and karmic justice, we've witnessed how a man's towering ambitions and insatiable desires can unravel everything he cherishes. From the moment Marcus Donovan betrayed his pregnant wife to the day she claimed a defining stake in his empire, destiny proved that true power lies not in wealth, but in loyalty, trust, and resilience. Eleanor's journey, rising from the ashes of humiliation to build a life of purpose and success, reminds us that no betrayal is ever the final chapter, and redemption often favors the strong of heart. If you found this story gripping and want more real-life drama and inspiring tales of transformation, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us bring you more compelling narratives. So stay tuned, and thank you for joining us on this unforgettable ride of scandal, sacrifice, and ultimate triumph.